Hello class, today we are going to be working on social structures and social interaction, which is chapter 4. We're going to talk about, we're going to start by talking about levels of sociological analysis. So these terms should be familiar to you. Macro level sociology, like conflict perspective and functionalist perspective, we would look at social structures or typical patterns of a group from a macro level or large scale perspective. So we would look at how the elite and the proletariat interact with each other based on a conflict perspective or a functionalist perspective, and you would analyze this interaction or group behavior differently. If you look at it from a micro level perspective, you would look at how everyday individual reactions or interactions shape the group behavior as a whole. And we do this on a variety of different levels. So if we're looking at the social structures that guide behavior, your guided behavior is based on your group location. So a social structure essentially talks about these typical patterns of a group, like how men and women interact, or how working class people and elites interact, and tells you what or gives you a good idea of what type of behavior you would expect to see from people who belong to that particular group. So if we're talking about something like social class, which components include income, education, occupation, and prestige, we can look at different social classes and see typical patterns of that group that guide their behavior. So people who live in lower socioeconomic status in an urban area are going to act very differently than people who live, for example, in a higher socioeconomic status, higher class, in a rural area. You're going to have different ways of dressing, different ways of interacting, different ways of speaking and relating to not only each other, but to society as a whole, what access you have to resources, that type of thing. So I'm going to skip social status for a second, and we're going to move on to social institutions. Social institutions are essentially how you experience social structures, because you're experiencing social structures through these institutions. So what are institutions? And the book gives you a nice little table and talks about it in terms of how you experience social institutions and how they shape your behaviors and your thoughts. So when we talk about something like family, religion, or education, what are the basic needs essentially that your family is going to give you access to? What are the basic needs that your education system is going to give you access to? Things like teaching you skills, teaching you basic academic requirements to be able to survive in this society. And all of these things, family, religion, economy, medicine, politics, they're all part of the social structure of the society that you live in, but each institution has its own set of norms, values, and mores. They guide your behavior in slightly different ways. Obviously, you would act very differently in your job than you would with your family. So it not only guides your behaviors and your thoughts, but sets expectations and an orientation to your life. How you should be acting, and how much access you have to these resources is going to shape your experience with every other institution within the society. So let's go back to what we call social status. A status is simply some type of position that an individual occupies. So we have all different types of status. Let's start with ascribed and achieved status. These are pretty easy. An ascribed status is something that is involuntary. So if you're, a good way to think about it is something you might be born with. So being born female is an ascribed status for me. Being born Hispanic is an ascribed status for me. Being a professor is an achieved status for me because I had to do something in order to achieve it. However, not every ascribed status is something that you're born with. Being a sister is also an ascribed status for me. I was not a voluntary participant in having a brother. That was an achieved status for my parents having a second child. Actually, I'm the second child, but it was an ascribed status for me. So if that helps you kind of negotiate between the two. So achieved status are things that are voluntary for you. You have to do something to accomplish it. And ascribed statuses are involuntary. You didn't have anything to do with gaining that particular status. A status set is simply a collection of statuses that you have. And we all have a status set. They are all different, but we all have them. So a status set would be, for example, for me, I'm a professor, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister. All of these are different positions that I occupy as an individual, but together they are a collection of statuses that I occupy. And a status symbol is simply something used to elicit a status recognition. So one of my statuses is that I'm a wife. A status symbol of that would be my wedding ring. So that type of symbol, whether or not it is a material object, is just something that signifies your particular status. Excuse me. A master status is a status that cuts across all your other statuses. It can be achieved or ascribed. So one of the examples I like to use is somebody who's in a wheelchair. They can be a dad, they can be a professor, and they can be, a baseball player. But everywhere they go, they are seen as being a person who is in a wheelchair. So that type of status becomes a master status because it cuts across all your other statuses. So I'm not a professor everywhere I go. Some places, when I go shopping, nobody's thinking of me as a professor. Or when I'm with my mother, she's not thinking of me as a professor. I'm just Guinevere to her. I'm just her daughter. So that is not a master status. But being female for me, it is something that is a master status because if I'm at work, I'm a female professor. As a spouse, I'm a female in my relationship. As a parent or a child, I'm still a female in that relationship. So that becomes a master status for me. Status inconsistency is simply when you have two statuses that don't seem like they match up. So I heard a story one time about a guy who was homeless, and he had lived on the streets, and he would he had like a big giant raincoat, and he would sleep in this raincoat, and he had his blankets, and he would leave his coat, on the street. Nobody would disturb it because they knew it was his. When he died, they found that his whole raincoat had been stuffed with money. The whole thing. He had quite a sum of money, enough money to buy himself a home, and probably much more. So he was a wealthy person who was homeless. And for most of us, we would consider this to be a status inconsistency. We would assume somebody who is homeless to have a lack of economic resources, but he did not. So that's a good example of a status inconsistency. Roles are simply society establishes and sets your roles. That's just the role that you have for the statuses. So we have, for every individual person, we have different roles for each one of our statuses. So as a As a wife, I can be somebody who brings in another income. I can also be somebody who acts as a friend and a mate. I'm also somebody who's there to, raise children with. All of those are the roles that society has established as part of my status as a spouse. So we have roles in our economic life. When you go to work, you have a role as to do your job. In your family, you have roles within your family. So in your family, you could be a son and a brother and a cousin, all within the same family. So you just have different roles within the family. I'm going to stop here, and when we come back, we'll talk about society.